This is a reading from Peter Uspensky's book, A New Model of the Universe. It's a chapter called Sex and Evolution, translated from the original Russian. And it contains many weighty ideas and solutions and answers to some of the big questions. So listen carefully. The enigma of death is connected with the enigma of birth. The enigma of disappearance with the enigma of appearance. The enigma of birth or appearance is connected with the enigma of love, with the enigma of sex. For example, the division of the sexes and their attraction to one another. A man dies, and the moments of his death agony, the moments of his last thoughts and realizations, his last sensations and last regrets, are connected with the sensation of love which create new birth. Which precedes and which follows the other. All this must be simultaneous. Then the soul sinks into sleep and then awakens in the same world as before, in the same house, with the same parents. What happens at the moment when, according to the old allegory, the serpent bites its own tail? And when the death agony of one life comes into contact with the sensations of love, which bring another life. In the idea of the interrelation of love and death may lie the explanation of many of the incomprehensible phenomena of our life. Many allegories and ancient teachings, which are obscure to us, may refer to the same idea. Such are the relation between death and resurrection in the mysteries. The idea of mystical death and mystical birth, and so on. In ancient teachings and cults, the words death and birth contained some strange enigma. These words had not one but several meanings. Sometimes birth signified death, sometimes death signified birth. The idea may have two meanings. The first is from the point of view of external recurrence. Death, that is, the end of one life, is birth, the beginning of another life. And the second meaning, which is more complex, is that death on our plane of being may be birth on some other superhuman plane of being. But here it is necessary to proceed very carefully in order to avoid the spiritualistic understanding of death as birth and birth as death. When physical death is regarded as birth on the astral plane in the world of spirits, and death in the world of spirits is regarded as birth on our plane. While at the same time a spirit differs very little from man, or even does not differ at all in his inner characteristics. The idea of the ancient mysteries is certainly far from such a two-dimensional view. The essence of the idea of the mysteries lies in the analogy of the incomprehensible new birth with the circumstances of man's physical birth on earth. Two sides are particularly emphasized here. First, the passing of one into a new life simultaneously with the death of many, and second, the enormous difference between that which dies and that which is born. That is, between the germ or the seed and the human being who is born from it, and who in his turn is a germ or a seed of another, a higher being, differing from him as much as man differs from the seed. Death is death. Death is not birth. But death contains the possibility of birth. Moreover, birth taking place on some other different plane cannot be visible or comprehensible on the plane on which death takes place. This was the content of the mysteries concerning death and birth. People, as was pointed out earlier, were regarded as grains, as seeds in the most real sense. The whole of their life was nothing but the life of seeds, that is, a life which has no meaning by itself, and which contains only one important moment, birth, or the death of the seed. This was the secret which was revealed to the initiated. The idea was that having learned, that is, having fully understood and felt this secret, the man could no longer remain as he was before. The new understanding began to work within by itself to give new meaning to the whole of life, and to guide his own life and activities along a new path. If we could accept the idea of man as a seed, and if we could find confirmation of it as a theory, this would radically change all our conceptions of man and humanity, and would explain at once many things at which before we have only dimly guessed. The life which we know in itself contains no aim. This is the reason why there is so much that is strange, incomprehensible, and inexplicable in it. And indeed it cannot be explained by itself. Neither its sufferings nor its joys, neither its beginning nor its end, nor its greatest achievements have any meaning. All these are either a preparation for some other future life, or merely nothing. By itself, life here on our plane has no value, no meaning, and no point. It is too short, too unreal, too ephemeral, too illusory for anything to be demanded of it, for anything to be built upon it, for anything to be created out of it. Its whole meaning lies in another, a new, a future life which follows upon birth. Does not this appear as the inner meaning of religious teachings of esoteric origin, particularly of Christianity? Does it not explain all that especially strikes us in life as incongruous and incompatible? If we, that is humanity, are only seeds, only germs, there cannot, nor could there possibly be any meaning in our life on this plane. The whole meaning lies in birth, and in another, a future life. But birth on that plane, on the plane of unknown new level of being, is neither accidental nor mechanical. This new birth cannot be the result of solely external causes and conditions, as birth on our plane of being seems to be. The new birth is a matter of will, a matter of the desire and efforts of the grain itself. This was the basis of the idea of initiation, which led to birth, and also of the idea of salvation and attainment to eternal life. Eternal life is a term which has several meanings, and it seems to contain a contradiction. On the one hand, eternal life belongs not only to all people, but even to everything that exists, while on the other hand, it is necessary to be born again in order to obtain it. This contradiction would be inexplicable if the difference between the fifth and the sixth dimensions had not been previously established. Both the one and the other are eternity, but one is unalterable repetition, always with the same end, and the other is escape from this repetition. Thus we see two ideas of birth: birth on the same plane, continuation of life, and birth on another plane, regeneration, transformation, escape from the first plane. This escape may imply so many new facts which are quite unknown and inconceivable on our plane that we can have no clear idea about the consequences of that escape. Birth, in the ordinary sense of the word, is connected with sex, with the division of the sexes, and with their attraction to one another, with love. This attraction of the sexes to one another constitutes one of the chief motive forces in life, and its intensity and the forms of its manifestation determine almost all other characteristics and qualities in man. As a rule, the stronger a man or woman, the greater the attraction that draws them to the opposite sex. The richer a man or woman is intellectually and emotionally, the greater is their understanding and appreciation of sex, and all that is concerned with sex. If there are exceptions, they are very rare, and therefore they only prove the rule. But even the most general view of the role of sex in life reveals the fact that the original aim of sex, that is the continuation of life or birth, recedes and is lost amid the clamor, the flash and sparkle of the emotions created by this eternal attraction and repulsion between the sexes. From the ordinary point of view, in creating love, that is, in creating the division of the sexes and everything connected with it, nature has only one aim, the continuation of life. But even from the ordinary point of view, it is perfectly clear, and there can be no doubt about it, that nature has created in man much more love than is actually necessary for the purpose of the continuation of life. All this surplus of love must be used up somehow, and under ordinary conditions it is used up by being transformed into other emotions and other kinds of energy, which often are contradictory, harmful from the point of view of evolution, pathological, incompatible with one another, and destructive. If it were possible to calculate how small a proportion of sex energy is actually used for the continuation of life, we should understand the basic principle of many of the actions of nature. Nature creates an immense pressure and immense tension in order to attain a certain aim, but in actual fact uses for the attainment of this aim only an infinitesimal fraction of the energy created. And yet, without this immense flow of force, probably the original aim would not be attained, and nature would be unable to make people serve her and continue their species to serve her. People would begin to bargain with nature, to put conditions to her, demand concessions, to demand alleviations, and nature would have to yield. The guarantee against this is the surplus of energy which binds a man, makes him a slave, forces him to serve the purposes of nature in the belief that he is serving himself, his own passions, his own desires, or on the contrary, it makes man believe that he is serving the purposes of nature, while in reality he serves his own passions and desires. Apart from the first and obvious aim, the continuation of life, and the securing of this continuation, sex serves two more aims of nature. And the existence of these two aims explains why the energy of sex is created in much greater quantity than is necessary for the continuation of life. One of these aims is the keeping up of the breed, the preservation of the species at a definite level. That is what is ordinarily called evolution, though evolution is usually endowed with other properties which in reality it does not possess. But what is possible in the sense of evolution, and what actually exists at the expense of the energy of sex. If the energy of sex in the particular breed is lacking, degeneration begins. The other far more deeply hidden aim of nature is evolution in the true meaning of the word, that is, the development of man in the direction of the acquisition by him of higher consciousness and the opening up of his latent forces and facilities. The explanation of this latter possibility in connection with the using of sex energy for this purpose forms the content and meaning of all esoteric teachings. Thus, sex contains not only two, but three aims, three possibilities. Before we pass to the third aim, that is, to the possibility of real evolution or the attainment of higher consciousness, we will examine the second, that is, the preservation of the species. If we take man and try to determine on the basis of all our biological knowledge what in man is the indication of the breed, that is, the indication of the preservation of species, we shall obtain an exact and very significant answer. In a human being, both in man and in woman, there are definite anatomical and physiological traits of the breed, and a high development of these traits points to a sound type, whereas a weak expression or a wrong expression of them definitely points to a degenerating type. These traits are the so-called secondary sexual characters. Secondary sexual characters is the name applied to features and qualities which, though not indispensable for the normal existence of the sex functions, that is, for all the sensations and phenomena connected with these functions, are nevertheless closely connected with the primary characters. This is shown by the fact that secondary characters depend upon the primary, that is, they are immediately modified, become weaker, or even disappear in the case of the weakening of direct functions or injury to the sex organs, that is, in case of change of the primary character. Secondary characters are all those features, apart from the sex organ themselves, which make man and woman different from and unlike one another. These features are difference in the lines of the body, independently of the anatomical structure of the skeleton, a different distribution of muscles and fat on the body, difference in movements, different distribution of hair on the body, a different voice, difference in instincts, sensations, tastes, temperament, emotions, reaction to external stimuli, etc. And further, a different mentality. All that makes up feminine psychology and masculine psychology. Academic biology does not attach sufficient importance to the study of secondary characters, and there is a tendency to limit the application of this term to those characters only which are very closely connected with sex functions. But in medicine, the study of secondary characters and of their alteration often served as a basis for the right distinguishing of various pathological states and for right diagnosis. It has been established beyond doubt for both man and woman that a weakening or an anatomical change of the essential parts of the sex organs or their injury leads to a complete alteration of the external type and to a change in the secondary characters, different for men and women, but in both cases following a certain definite system. That is to say, in a man, an injury to his sex organs and the derangement of their functions causes him to resemble either a child or an old woman. In a woman, the same thing causes her to resemble a man. This gives the possibility of the converse conclusion, namely that a type differing from the normal type, that is, a man with the features, properties, and characters of a woman, or a woman with the features, properties, and characters of a man, indicates firstly degeneration, and secondly wrong development, that is, usually underdevelopment of the primary characters. Thus, a normal development of sex is a necessary condition of a rightly developing type, and abundance and richness of secondary characters points to an improving and ascending type. The decline of the type, the decline of the breed, always means the weakening and alteration of secondary characters, that is, the appearance of a masculine character in a woman and feminine characters in man. Intermediate sex is the most characteristic phenomenon of degeneration. Normal development of sex is necessary for the preservation and improvement of the breed. The second aim of nature, which is attained in this case, is perfectly clear. And it is clear that the surplus of sex energy is used precisely for the improvement of the breed. The third aim of nature connected with sex, that is, the evolution of man towards Superman, differs from the first two aims in that it requires conscious actions on the part of the man himself, and a definite orientation of his whole life, an idea of which is given by the systems of yoga. Almost all the occult teachings which recognize the possibility of the evolution or transformation of man see the basis of this possible transformation in the transmutation, that is, the transfiguration of certain matters or energies into quite different matters or energies. In this case, in the transformation of sex energy into energy of a higher order. This is the inner meaning, sometimes deeply hidden, sometimes almost obvious, of many occult teachings, of theories of alchemy, of various forms of mysticism, yoga, and the like. In all the teachings that admit the possibility of the change and inner growth of an individual man, that is, evolution not in the biological and or anthropological sense, but as applying to the individual, this evolution is always based on the transmutation of sex energy. The utilization of this energy, which is wasted unproductively in ordinary life, creates in a man's soul the force which leads him to the superhuman. There is no other force in man which could replace sex energy. All other energies, intellect, will, feeling, feed on the surplus of sex energy, grow out of it, and live by it. The mystical birth of man, of which many systems speak, is based on the transmutation, that is, on the transmutation of sex energy. There are many occult and religious systems which not only recognize this, but attempt to give practical directions as how to curb the energy of sex and how to submit it to the interests of inner evolution. These directions are usually utterly fantastic and cannot give any results because they omit something which is most vital and most necessary. Nevertheless, the study of such theories and methods presents a certain interest from the psychological and historical point of view. But before coming to the study of the ideas of transmutation, both in their right form from the very few existing sources and in their wrong form from the very numerous sources, it is necessary to elucidate certain aspects of the biology and functioning of sex when it fulfills the two first designs of nature. Namely, it is necessary to establish whether sex in itself evolves. Can forms of evolving sex be found in man? Does the evolution of sex exist, that is, the evolution of primary characters and evolution of sex functions? And what does the evolution of sex functions mean? If evolution of sex exists, there should be forms lower than the forms we consider normal, and there should be forms higher than the forms we consider normal. What, then, is the lower form, and what is the higher form? The moment we ask ourselves this question, we are confused and perplexed by the ordinary conceptions of naive Darwinism and of the usual evolutionary theories which tell us of lower forms of sex in lower organisms, in plants, etc., of the propagation of fungi and the like. But all this is quite outside the scope of the question we have set ourselves. We are dealing only with man, and we must think only of man. In examining the question before us, we must try to establish what constitutes normal sex in man, then determine the lower forms of the sex life of man, that is, the forms which correspond to a degenerating type, or to a type arrested in its development, and then determine the higher, that is, evolving forms, if such forms exist. The difficulty of defining normal sex is created first of all by the indeterminatedness of the characteristics and properties of lower sex, also by the complete absence of any understanding of what higher sex may be, and further at times even by confusing of the lower with the higher, or of the degenerating with the evolving. Taking all this into consideration, it is necessary, before attempting to define normal sex, to determine lower sex, or infrasex, less than sex. A beginning has to be made with infrasex, because an understanding of supersex can only be arrived at through the elimination of everything that is determined first as infrasex and second as normal sex. It is comparatively easy to establish infrasex if we take as its chief characteristic arrested development or a degeneration which has begun or is beginning. But the detection of infrasex is impeded by the variety and contradictory nature of the forms in which infrasex is manifested, and especially by the fact that some of these forms, from the ordinary point of view, to be a strengthening and an exaggerated development of sex energy, sex desires, and sex sensations. Therefore, from the very beginning, infrasex must be divided into two categories: obvious degeneration and hidden degeneration. To the first category of infrasex belong most declining forms of manifestations of sex, such as all obvious sex abnormalities, that is, underdeveloped sex, all perversions, in the sense of either abnormal sex desires or abnormal sex abstinence, disgust of sex, fear of sex, indifference to sex, interest in one's own sex, though the latter has quite a different meaning in men from what it has in women, and in women is not necessarily a sign of infrasex. To the second category of infrasex belongs cases which are often connected with heightened intensity of sex life, which, while externally appearing to be normal, though exaggerated, in reality also point to inner degeneration. This category of infrasex will be dealt with later. For all categories of infrasex, the fundamental characteristic is the absence of coordination between the idea of sex and the ideas of other normal functions in man. Sex always leads people of infrasex either into temptation or sin or crime or insanity or debauchery. For a normal man or woman, sex contains no danger. In a normal human being, sex harmonizes with all other functions, including the emotional and intellectual, and even with the desire for the miraculous, if such exists in the soul of a man. A man's thoughts, emotions, aspirations, none of them contradict sex, nor does sex contradict them. Sex inwardly is completely justified in normal man, and this justification is based solely on the full coordination of sex with the intellectual and emotional functions. But if a man is born abnormal, or becomes abnormal, a negative attitude towards sex and condemnation of sex almost always grow within him. Abnormalities may be very different, There may be total impotence, incapacity both for external function and for sensation. There may be capacity for sensation connected with the incapacity for external function. That is, the presence of desires, but the impossibility of satisfying them. There may be capacity for external function connected with the complete absence of sensation. There may be capacity for sensation only on the condition of abnormal external functions. In all of these cases, sex sensations are accompanied by a feeling of disharmony between sex and other sides of inner life, particularly with the higher, or those which are taken to be the higher, and as a result, there arises a non-understanding of sex, terror of sex, and disgust of sex. Infrasex, which condemns sex and repels it as offense, represents a very curious phenomenon in the life and in the history of humanity. In this case, sex and all that refers to sex is declared to be sin. Woman is the instrument of the devil. Man is the devil, the tempter. The idea of purity is sexual impotence, infantile, senile, or pathological, which in this case is manifested either in abstinence, taken for an act of will, or in absence of interest towards sex, which is explained by the prevalence of other spiritual interests. In people of infrasex, sex is sometimes more easily subordinated to intellectual and emotional tendencies, usually of a negative character, than in normal man or woman. Sex has no independent existence in a being of infrasex, or in any case, it differs greatly from sex in a normal man or woman. To a man of infrasex, therefore, a normal man appears as a man possessed by some incomprehensible and hostile force. And a man of infrasex considers it his duty to struggle with this force in other people, because he believes that he has conquered it in himself. And this really explains the whole mechanism of the influence that infrasex has on life. Among other people, the people of infrasex appear the most moral, in religion the most saintly. It is easy for them to be moral, and it is easy to be saintly. Of course, it is pseudo-morality and pseudo-saintliness, but people generally live with pseudo-values, and only extremely few wish to find real values. It is necessary to understand that almost all the morality of which has been imposed upon the human race, almost all the laws controlling sex life, almost all the restrictions guiding people's choice and decisions in these cases, all taboos, all fears, all these have come from infrasex. Infrasex, precisely in its virtue of its difference from normal sex, in virtue of its inability to become normal, and in virtue of its non-understanding of normal sex, began to regard itself as superior, began to dictate laws to normal sex. This does not mean that all morals, all laws, and all restrictions relating to sex were wrong, but as always occurs in life when right ideas come from the wrong source, together with what is right, they bear within them a great deal that is wrong, that contradicts their fundamental essence, and brings about new confusions and new complications. In the whole history of mankind, it is impossible to find a more striking example of pathological forms making laws for normal forms, unless we take a broader view and realize that, in fact, the whole history of mankind is nothing but the rule of pathological forms over the normal. Moreover, it is very characteristic that while infrasex continually holds in suspicion and mercilessly condemns normal sex and its manifestations, it shows much more tolerance towards pathological perverted forms. Thus, infrasex always finds an excuse and a justification for people of intermediate sex, and for their tendencies, as well as for various abnormal means of sexual satisfaction. Of course, people of abnormal inclinations are by this very fact people of infrasex, but they are not aware of this, and often are definitely proud of their difference from the people of normal sex, which they regard as coarse and animal, lacking in refinement, which they ascribe to themselves. There are even theories which regard intermediate sex as a result of evolution. All that has been said until now refers only to one category of infrasex, although in this category there can clearly be seen several forms, from impotence to homosexuality. The other category of infrasex does not include either impotence or unnatural inclinations, and as was pointed out earlier, manifestation of this category, with the exception of extremes bordering on obvious insanity, are not usually taken as abnormal. Phenomena of this category can be divided into two groups. To the first group belong those manifestations of sex which are colored with what may be called the psychology of the lupanar. A definition of lupanar is Latin for a wolf pack or a prostitute. And to the second group belong those manifestations of sex which are characterized by their close relation to oppressive and morbid emotions of a violent or despondent character. Both groups can be explained by the fact that sex, and all that relates to sex, possesses the capacity to connect itself with the most contradictory sides of a human being. In the first group, sex is connected with what is lowest in man. For such a man, sex is surrounded with an atmosphere of uncleanness. A man speaks and thinks of sex with unclean words and unclean thoughts. At the same time, he is a slave to sex and is aware of his slavery, and it appears to him that all other people are slaves just as he is. He mentally throws dirt on sex and on everything connected with sex, invents indecent anecdotes, or likes to listen to them. His whole life is full of obscene language. Everything is as unclean to him as he is himself. If he does not degrade sex, he derides it, takes it as a joke, tries to find something comic in sex. This looking for the comic in sex, the introduction of laughter into sex, gives rise to a special kind of pseudo-art, pornography, which is characterized precisely by the derision of the sex act. Without this derision, erotic art, even in its very extreme forms, may be quite normal and legitimate, as it was, for instance, in the Greek and Roman worlds, in ancient India, in Persia, at the period of the flourishing of Sufism, etc. The absence of erotic art, or wrong forms of it, points to the contrary, to the very low moral level of the particular culture, and to the preponderance of infrasex. Infrasex, in all its manifestations, of course, tries to confuse erotic art with pornography. For infrasex, there is no difference between these two phenomena. With regard to normal sex, it is necessary to point out that there is no laughter in it. The function of sex cannot be comic. It cannot be an object of a joke. This is one of the characteristics of normal sex. To continue the enumeration of the features of that form of infrasex which is characterized by the psychology of the lupanar. It may be said that this form is determined by the separation of sex from all other functions, and by the antagonism of sex to all other functions. For the intellectual and for the emotional life, even merely for physical activity, In the case of the people of this form of infrasex, sex is only an impediment, an obstacle, a waste of force, a waste of energy. This waste of energy in sex functions, and the realization of this waste is one of the distinctive traits of the form of infrasex in question. In normal sex, this waste does not exist, since energy is immediately renewed because of the richness and positive character of the sensations, thoughts, and emotions connected with sex. The form of infrasex in question is often very active in its manifestations in life and is widespread. Owing to many peculiarities in our life, especially owing to the power of the abnormal over the normal and of the lower over the higher, many people who do not in fact belong to infrasex learn about sex only from people of this form of infrasex. In other words and expressions belonging to this form of infrasex, and they at once receive a shock from sex as from something unclean. They are repelled by the psychology of the lupanar, but they cannot throw off the impression they have received. They begin to believe that there is nothing else, and their own mentality in relation to sex becomes colored and impregnated with distrust, suspicion, fear, and repugnance. And their fears and their repugnance in relation to this form of manifestations of sex would be very well grounded if only they knew that the abnormal cannot be taken as the law for the normal, and that in avoiding the abnormal, it is important not to sacrifice the normal. Sex in this form is very closely related to crime, and actually in life, a criminal character, criminal tendencies, are scarcely ever met with apart from this form of infrasex. Even in ordinary scientific psychology, this form of sex manifestation, which is devoid of any connection with moral feeling, is defined as the lower or the animal, and the predominance of this form of infrasex in life, which above all shows the level on which humanity stands, and it is the predominance of this form of infrasex in life, which above all shows the level on which humanity stands. In the second group of manifestations of this category of infrasex, that is, in the group in which sex functions are not decreased, but on the contrary are even increased in comparison with the normal, sex is connected with all that is violent and cruel in a man. A man of this form of infrasex seems continually to be walking on the edge of a precipice. Sex and all emotions belonging to sex become in him inevitably connected with irritation, suspicion, and jealousy. At any moment he may find himself completely in the power of a sense of injury, insulted self-pride, a frightened sense of ownership, and there are no forms of cruelty and violence of which he is not capable in order to avenge his outraged honor or injured feelings. All kinds of crimes of passion, without an exception, belong to this form of infrasex. Quoting the words of Professor Charleson, who wrote that many efforts and prolonged work on oneself are necessary in order to become accustomed to the teaching of relativity. But a much greater mental effort is needed in order to see infrasex and nothing else in all crimes and murders that are committed from jealousy, suspicion, desire for revenge, etc. But if we make this effort and understand that in the figure of Othello there is nothing but pathology, that is, abnormal and perverted emotions, the lies by which humanity has lived and lives becomes clear to us. The difficulty of understanding the nature of this particular category of infrasex is created by the continual embellishment of and the desire to ennoble and justify all manifestations of violence, and the degenerate emotions connected with sex and with crimes of passion. All the power of the hypnosis of art and literature is directed towards the glorification of these emotions and these crimes. It is this hypnosis which above all stands in the way of the right understanding of things and makes people who do not belong to Infra at all consider themselves obliged to think, feel, and act like people of Infra. All that has been said about Infra can be summarized in the following propositions. The first category of Infra, from impotence to perversions, borders on manias and phobias, that is, on pathological proclivities and pathological fears. The second category, in its first animal form, is nearer to idiocy, to absence of moral feeling, and in its second, more violent form, has resemblance to delusional insanity or homicidal mania, and even in its milder manifestations is full of fixed ideas and fixed mental images which are accompanied or evoked by tormenting and violent emotions. So far I have spoken chiefly of Infra, but I have incidentally pointed out certain features of normal sex. Normal sex, being the complete opposite of Infra, is first of all entirely coordinated with other sides of man's life and with his higher manifestations. It does not stand in their way and does not take energy from them. The energy used in the functioning of normal sex is immediately replaced owing to the richness of the sensations and impressions which are received by the intellect, the consciousness, and the feeling. Further, in normal sex there is nothing that can be the subject of laughter, or that can be connected with anything that may be negative in man. On the contrary, it repels, as it were, everything that is negative, and this in spite of the very great intensity of sensations and feelings connected with it. It does not follow that a man of normal sex is free from sufferings or disappointments connected with sex life. So far from that, these sufferings may be very intense and acute, but they are never caused by the inner discord between sex and other functions, especially intellectual or higher emotional functions, as is the case in Infra. Normal sex is coordinated and harmonious, but life is not coordinated and is not harmonious. Therefore, normal sex may often bring much suffering, but a man of normal sex does not blame other people for his sufferings, as does not try to make others suffer. In his feeling there is a great understanding of the inevitability and fatality of everything connected with sex. And it is this understanding of the inevitability that helps him to find a way through the maze of contradictory emotions. The contradictory and uncoordinated nature of many emotions connected with sex, apart from the influence of life in general and the various kinds of infrasex, is often due, in people of normal sex, to a different cause. This cause has hardly been touched upon by Western psychology, though at the same time it is perfectly clear to ordinary observation. This cause is the difference between body types. Science has approached and is approaching from different sides the idea of the difference of types, but the fundamental principles of this difference are as yet unknown. Until quite recently, the old division into 4 temperaments, with certain modifications, was admitted. Some time ago, there were established different types of memory, such as auditory, visual, narrative, and so on. At present, there are established 4 types of blood. In endocrinology, there are attempts to divide men into types according to their formulae or according to their constellation. That is, according to the combination of inner secretions working in them. But all this is yet very far from the recognition of the radical and essential difference between various types of people, and from the actual establishing of these types. Exact and complete knowledge of types exists only in esoteric doctrines, and therefore does not enter into the scope of the present subject. All that can be established by means of ordinary observation is confined to the fact that in relation to the life of sex, both men and women are divided into a certain number, and not a very large number, of fundamental types. That number is 7, with 28 subdivisions. For every type of one sex, there is one or several positive types of the opposite sex, which arouse desire, then several indifferent, and several definitely negative, that is, repellent types. In connection with this, complicated combinations are possible when, for instance, a certain type of woman is positive for a certain type of man, but the given type of man is either negative or indifferent for the given type of woman, and vice versa. In this case, a union between 2 wrongly assorted types produces both external and internal manifestations of infrasex of one of the categories enumerated above. This means that for the normal manifestation of sex, there is necessary not only a normal state in both man and woman, but the union of 2 corresponding types. For a right understanding of esoteric theories concerning sex, it is necessary to have at least a general conception of the role and significance of types in the life of sex. From the ordinary point of view, people, both men and women, are considered to be much more alike than they really are, and much freer in their decisions and in their choice, which seems to be unrestricted except by general conditions of life, division of classes, and so on. In reality, even with the help of generally known psychological material, it is impossible to understand how the division of types is manifested in life and how people depend upon this division. The strangeness of love has always occupied men's imagination. Why does this man love this woman and not that one? And why does the woman love another man and not him, and so on? Where is the end and where is the beginning in this strange game of attractions, feelings, moods, sensations, vanities, and disappointments? The answer is only in the division of types. In order to understand the principle of this division, it is necessary to realize that for every man, all the women in the world are divided into several categories, according to the degree of their potential physical and emotional influence upon him, and quite independently of his or their expressed taste, sympathies, and inclinations. Women of the first category, of whom there are very few for each man, arouse in him the maximum of feeling, desire, imagination, and dreaming. They attract him irresistibly, regardless of any barriers and obstacles, often to his great astonishment, and in the case of mutual love, arouse in him the maximum of sensation. Such women remain ever new and ever unknown. A man's curiosity about them never weakens, and their love never becomes for him ordinary, possible, or explicable. There always remains in it an element of the miraculous and the impossible, and there is no fading of his own feeling. Women of the second category, of whom there are many more for a man, also attract him, but in these cases his feelings are more easily controlled by reason or external conditions. It is a calmer love, which is more easily fitted into conventional forms, both inner and outer, and may pass more easily into a feeling of friendship or sympathy, and can fade and disappear, but always leaving a warm memory behind it. Women of the third category leave a man indifferent, If they are young and attractive, they can affect his imagination. Not directly, however, but through some other life interests such as self-pride, vanity, material considerations, community of interest, sympathy, or friendship. But this feeling, having come from without, does not endure long and fades. The sensations are weak and colorless. The first satisfactions usually exhaust all interest. Sometimes, if their first sensations were sufficiently vivid, they can change into their opposites, antipathy, hostility, and the like. Women of the fourth category interest a man still less. They also can attract him in certain cases, or he may deceive himself and think they attract him. But physical relations with them contain a tragic element. A man does not feel them at all. The continuation of intimacy with them is a mechanical violation of self and may bear heavily upon the nerves, produce impotence and various other phenomena of infrasex. It must of course be understood that a woman belonging to one category for one man may belong to quite a different category for another man, and that the number of categories may be larger or smaller for different people. Women are in exactly the same position. For them also, there are different categories of men, and just as little depends on their own intellectual or emotional decisions and choice. Both the choice and the decisions are made for them. No moral principles, no feeling of duty, affection, gratitude, friendship, sympathy, pity, no community of ideas and no community of interests can create a sensation when it is not there, or stand in its way when it is there. That is, nothing can change anything in this truly iron law of types. In ordinary life, owing to the many external influences which control people's lives, the law of the attraction and repulsion of types becomes partly modified, but in one direction only. This means that even the right and corresponding types may be repelled by one another and not feel one another under the influence of emotional conflicts and difference in taste and understanding. But wrong and non-corresponding types cannot ever, or in any circumstances, feel one another. Moreover, even the slightest element of infrasex, either in the man or in the woman, brings their relations, their feelings, and their sensations of one another down to a lower category, or even completely destroys all that was positive in them. If any escape from the law of the action of types is at all possible, it is possible only through following the principles of karma yoga, and with the condition of a full understanding of the nature of the difference between types. But this relates to the life of those who see, or are beginning to see. In ordinary life, in general, the leading principle is blindness. But this blindness is particularly striking in relation to questions of sex. Thus, in ordinary understanding, the idea is not admitted and is even entirely unknown, that in the case of wrong combination of types, one of them or both will not feel the other at all. Further, it is not taken into consideration that there is nothing more painful and more immoral than sex relations without sensations. Also, that the degree and the quality of the sensations can be very different. The fact of the possible absence of sex sensations in sex relations is of course known, but it is not regarded as dependent upon types. This is not taken into consideration at all, undoubtedly owing to the influences of infrasex upon life. Nevertheless, people realize the danger of a wrong choice and the intention to avoid the consequences of a wrong choice, and entrust the choice to one who knows more, lies at the basis of the esoteric idea of the marriage sacrament, which has to be performed by the initiate. The true role of the initiate certainly did not consist in performing a mechanical ceremony which allowed people to have sex relations. and people came to the initiate not for this ceremony, but for advice for the final decision. The initiate determined their body types, determined whether they were suited to one another or not, gave advice, and decided whether particular marriage could take place or not. Such was, or such may have been, the marriage sacrament. But of course this was forgotten long ago, together with the teachings on types and the idea of esoteric knowledge. Poets have always been aware of the other side of the idea, and have sung of the irresistible force which attracts inwardly related types to one another. Types who nothing can part and nothing can prevent from striving towards each other. When such types meet, the result is a case of ideal and eternal love, which gives material to poets for thousands of years. This idea of the mutual gravitation of inwardly related types constitutes the inner meeting of the allegory in Plato's Symposium about people's severed halves seeking one another. But in actual life, the dreams of poets and philosophers are very seldom realized, and in the conditions of our discordant existence, the meetings of the most suitable types is, on the contrary, the most dangerous case, chiefly owing to the accumulation of stormy emotions, and almost invariably ends in tragedy, and in Plato's halves again losing each other. The teaching on body types is of the highest importance because normal sex can manifest itself rightly and in a certain sense evolve only with a successful combination of types. It is also necessary to understand that the division of types in itself is the result of evolution, because among more primitive people, the types are divided less markedly and completely, so that strongly expressed type is a kind of secondary character. We must now try to establish what higher sex may be and whether any forms actually exist which can be considered as belonging to supersex. But it is not an easy task to define supersex. To be more precise, the scientific material at our disposal contains no data for such a definition. And for material bearing on this question, it is necessary to turn to esoteric doctrines. All that it is possible to do using the ordinary and generally accessible material is to determine what is not supersex. Because though ordinary thought does not contain the notion of infrasex and supersex, the idea of them is very near to it, and, as it were, continually rises up behind ordinary conceptions. And very often, in thinking of sex functions, people divide them, for instance, into purely animal or physical manifestations, which they look upon as infrasex, as it were, and spiritualized manifestations, which for them take the place of supersex, or they introduce the idea of love as opposed to sex feeling or sex instinct. In other words, the ideas of infrasex and supersex are not so far away from our thoughts as might first appear. In fact, people always use these ideas in thinking about sex, but very often associate them with totally wrong images and conceptions. Moreover, and this is particularly important, certain forms of infrasex are often taken for supersex. This happens because people, dimly realizing the difference in manifestations of sex, but actually encountering, besides normal sex, only infrasex, have taken the degeneration of sex for the evolution of sex. In this case, they have followed the line of least resistance, submitting to the influence of infrasex. They have taken infrasex for supersex. They have begun to regard normal sex from the standpoint of infrasex as something anomalous, unclean, hindering the salvation or the liberation of man. It is only in those esoteric doctrines which have not passed through ecclesiastical and scholastic forms, or have been preserved beneath the layers of ecclesiastical and scholastic forms, that traces of teachings on sex can be found that are worth attention. In order to discover these traces, it is necessary to re-examine what is to be found on this subject in the doctrine of esoteric origin that are unknown to us. From the standpoint of esoteric doctrines, the outward aim of sex, that is, the continuation of life, and also the perfecting of the breed by the development of secondary characters, is regarded as mechanically assured, and the whole attention of these doctrines is turned towards the hidden aim, that is the possibility of a new birth, which on the contrary is not assured at all. To return to the idea of transmutation, or the intentional using of sex energy for the purposes of inner evolution, it must be noted that all the systems that recognize transmutation and the role of sex in transmutation may be divided into two categories. To the first belong those systems which admit the possibility of the transmutation of sex energy in conditions of normal sex life and normal expenditure of sex energy. To the second belong those systems which admit the possibility of transmutation only on the condition of complete sex abstinence and asceticism. Whether or not we agree with the fundamental propositions of the theory of transmutation itself, the systems of the second category, that is, those which admit the possibility of transmutation on the condition of asceticism only, are historically more familiar to us and more comprehensible. The reason for this lies in the fact that the principal religions of cultured humanity of the more recent epoch, Buddhism and Christianity, held and still hold this point of view, that is, that sex life is a hindrance to the salvation of man, or in any case something that can be admitted only as a sad necessity, a concession to the weakness of man. Judaism is also nearer this point of view than the opposite one, and so is Mohammedanism, which after all is nothing but Reformed Judaism, liberated only from the spirit of depression and despondency, but persevering almost the whole ethics of Judaism and a rather scornful attitude towards sex. Buddhism in its essence was a monastic order, but the teachings of Gautama the Buddha were always addressed to monks and contained the exposition of the principles and rules of the shortest way to nirvana as they understood it. Laymen were admitted to Buddhism only later, and only as disciples preparing to become monks. Special rules were made for them which represented a mitigated monastic discipline. These are the so-called 5 precepts, the acceptance of which signifies the embracing of Buddhism. Sex is still admitted here. The third of these precepts reads, I observe the precept to abstain from unlawful sexual intercourse. This means that there are still certain forms which are considered lawful. But the next grade of Buddhism, 8 precepts, includes a complete renunciation of sex life. The precept containing sex reads, I observe the precept to abstain from sexual intercourse. That is, the word unlawful is omitted, or in other words, all forms of sex life, both abnormal and normal, are regarded as unlawful. Those who have accepted the 8 precepts do not necessarily live in monasteries, but they live like monks. Thus, Buddha and his nearest disciples considered the first condition of the transmutation of sex energy, the idea of which must have been clear to them, to be complete abstinence. Christianity stands very near to Buddhism in this respect, and it is quite possible that this side of Christian teaching developed under the influence of Buddhist preachers. The role of the Apostle Paul and the influence of Judaism in creating the Christian view of sex have been pointed out earlier. Jesus is even more definite from this point of view. We know nothing about his sex life. So as far as we know, there was no woman in his life. Even in the temptation in the wilderness, the devil does not try to seduce him with a woman. The devil shows him the kingdoms of the world in all their glory, promises a miracle, but does not offer love. Evidently by the design, by the idea of the author who created the drama of Christ, Christ was already beyond the temptations and these possibilities. We may now ask ourselves whether Christ and the Buddha were not men of supersex. There are no grounds which would permit us to classify them as belonging to infrasex. At the same time, they undoubtedly differed from ordinary men. Unfortunately, we have no information concerning the structure of the body of Jesus and his external characters. All the representations of him of the first centuries are quite arbitrary. But with regard to the Buddha, the position is different because there exists a very exact and detailed description of the structure of his body and all his external features and characters. I mean by this the so-called 32 signs of Buddhahood, the 18 minor marks. They are listed in this book. I'm losing my voice, so I'm going to skip ahead and end this. I'm going to do a video on the body types, which will be probably the first time that's been out in the public for thousands of years. But the psychological picture of man's approach to supersex is a little clearer for us. There are in life strange emotions and strange sensations, inexplicable from an ordinary point of view, and in love and all sex sensations. There is a strange melancholy and a strange sadness. The more a man feels, the stronger in him is this sensation of farewell, this sensation of parting. This sensation of parting arises from the fact that in a man or woman of strong feeling, sex sensations awaken certain new states of consciousness, new emotions. And these new emotions change emotions of sex, cause them to fade and disappear. In this lies the secret of the deep melancholy of the most vivid sex sensations. There is an autumnal taste to them, the taste of something that must pass, must die, must cede its place to something else. This something else is the new consciousness, for the definition and description of which there are no words, but which, of all we know, only sex sensations approach. Mystical states possible to men show a very strange relationship between mystical experiences and experiences of sex. Mystical sensations undoubtedly and incontestably have a taste of sex. To put it more correctly, of all ordinary human experiences, only sex sensations approach those which we may call mystical. Of all we know in life, only in love is there a taste of the mystical, a taste of ecstasy. Nothing else in our life brings us so near to the limit of human possibilities, beyond which the unknown. And in this lies without doubt the chief cause of the terrible power of sex over human souls. But at the same time, sex sensations disappear in the light of mystical experiences. The first sensations of mystical experiences intensify sex sensations, but the further waves of the light that a man begins to see completely absorb and cause to disappear those small sparks of sensations which before seemed to him a blaze of love and passion. Consequently, in true mysticism there is no sacrifice of feeling. Mystical sensations are sensations of the same category as the sensations of love, only infinitely higher and more complex. Love, sex, These are but a foretaste of mystical sensations. It is clear that the foretaste must disappear when there comes that which has been anticipated. But it is equally clear that struggle with the foretaste, the sacrifice of the foretaste, the giving up of the foretaste, cannot bring nearer or hasten anything. Ordinary knowledge has not sufficient material for determining the course of this transformation, nor for determining the essential nature of supersex, and only an entirely new study of man, started and conducted on the conditions of the abandonment of all petrified theories and principles, can discover the ways to the understanding of true evolution. I just want to leave you with a little teaser thought is people come out of other people, so we are fractal in nature. And I think this goes along with him saying that humanity as we see it are seeds.